in 2015, many countries around the world signed up to the Paris Agreement, and in that they committed to decarbonize at their own pace, but many countries have committed to a specific decarbonization target. And in order to reach that target and to implement this commitment, countries are having to implement laws that are slowly but surely going to help to decarbonize production. And South Africa also has a climate change bill, which is currently on the president's table for signature, which also starts to bring in carbon budgets, and we have a carbon tax. And so with that, there's been this shift towards greater sustainability from a regulatory and a legal point of view. At the same time, we've seen a very big increase from a consumer demand point of view, and also from a shareholder, from shareholder pressure on corporations and companies. And many of the companies, for instance, didn't wait for regulations to come through. Companies have made commitments and have been implementing some type of initially CSI or environmental, social, and governance metrics for quite a long time now. What is changing is, at the moment, is that those are standardizing, but also becoming mandatory in a number of countries. So again, there, the European Union is leading the charge. The two main directives here that are important to note is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. Now, these are both, they've both sort of been implemented in the last few years. The one, been passed in the last few years, and are set to be implemented as of this year over time, over the next sort of 5 years. And they're slightly different. The reporting directive essentially makes it mandatory to report on a lot of the metrics that, a lot of ESG metrics. And so this is going to apply to a lot more companies that are currently having to report on their environmental and social impacts in Europe at the moment. And it will also force these companies, and many of them are retailers and companies that are importing a lot of our goods, to look at their Scope 3 or their supply chain emissions. So that, together with a Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which essentially places a burden of responsibility on the company for environmental and social and human rights issues in its supply chain. Those two together with a whole raft of other sustainability regulations coming out of the EU, are going to make it a lot more difficult for products that have a high carbon intensity, essentially, to be competitive in the European market. And Western Cape and South Africa, we export a lot to Europe. It's also going to force a lot more reporting and assurance and verification. And so the faster we as a jurisdiction are able to enable companies to be able to decarbonize on the one hand, whether that be by being able to connect to their own sources of renewable energy through wheeling agreements, etc., or ultimately to decarbonize the grid. The more important that is for export competitiveness. Now, at the same time, and we are talking about the carbon border adjustment mechanism here, and that's, again, certain big emitters, but those are also important sectors. At the same time, while we're talking about export competitiveness, it has a very, very big impact on your competitiveness as an investment destination, because a large amount of investors who come here set up in order to be able to export. And one of our big export markets, as I mentioned, is the European Union. And because we have preferential access to the European Union, it is a competitive destination in which to invest in order to export back into the European Union. And increasingly, it is already it is already such that you can no longer be in a competitive investment destination, a destination for foreign direct investment, if you can't provide clean energy to investors. And so the faster we are able to, and we have made a lot of progress here. So in order to be a competitive investment destination, it's incredibly important to be able to, and will become increasingly so, to be able to access, for your investors, for your companies, for your businesses, to be able to access clean energy. And not only to be able to access clean energy, obviously at a competitive price, but also to be able to do all the necessary reporting and verification and have the certifications in order to prove that that energy is, in fact, clean. And so from a competitiveness point of view, the CBAM is, it's playing out in two different ways internationally. There's a lot of, it's very contentious. There's a lot of pushback from, especially from the global south. South Africa is vocally against it, as is India. And there are definitely questions around compatibility with the WTO, with the World Trade Organization. And there is a large discussion going on internationally. At this point, it remains untested, but it may be that it gets taken to the World Trade Organization and does get tested. It's seen as a unilateral measure, and the argument is that there should be bigger consensus, and that these types of measures should be decided on internationally, and everybody should be brought on board, and that it shouldn't be just unilaterally implemented by specific countries or jurisdictions. And at the same time, in international trade law, for instance, you do have special dispensations for developing countries and least developed countries, and the carbon border adjustment mechanism doesn't allow for any type of dispensation like that. So there is an argument that it's not the most fair way of doing this, and questions around whether this mechanism is specifically actually going to achieve the carbon goals or the decarbonisation goals and climate goals that it purports to be there to achieve, but that it is perhaps more of a protectionist measure. These are all arguments that are being put out, and that there are other measures that could be implemented that could help achieve the same goals. On the other hand, mostly developed countries are looking at how to implement their own CBAMs, because the carbon border adjustment mechanism takes into account, the EU one, takes into account the price paid on carbon in the exporting country. So they'll take into account the carbon tax in South Africa. But the carbon tax in South Africa is very low compared to the price of carbon in the EU. And so the higher the price of carbon in the exporting country, the more of that money will stay in the exporting country, as opposed to being paid as a tax to the European Union. So countries like the UK, US, and Japan, for instance, are looking at ways of implementing essentially raising their own carbon price or tax in order to, and implementing a CBAM of sorts themselves, in order to keep more of that tax money within their own countries and in their own jurisdictions. So those are, the approaches. Of course, it all depends again on the carbon intensity of your exports. South Africa is very negatively acted there. If the number of countries that are using reasonably clean energy, for instance, hydro, they won't be as impacted when it comes to energy source. Obviously, a lot of the products that fall under the CBAM are just simply very energy intense. But those are the three factors: the carbon intensity that are not in South Africa's favor, the carbon intensity, the fact that our carbon tax is quite low, and the fact that we export quite a lot to the EU.